I gotta say, I'm really excited to bring in our next guest. He's a former journalist and media executive, Steve Krakauer, and he's written a fantastic book about a subject that we pay a lot of attention to here on the U.S. Report, namely the American media. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. I gotta say, as someone who loves the media but thinks it's got a lot of problems, that your manuscript really hit home. Welcome to the program, and we have talked a lot about it on this show, but you open up your book talking about that laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop, and how it was instantly decided almost by the hive mind that it was false, despite heaps of evidence to the contrary. And I would love to just get your thoughts, first of all, on how this sort of thinking is affecting democracy in America.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate that. I agree. I think the Hunter Biden laptop story really is so emblematic of all the problems that we have with the press over the last few years that started maybe with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, shocked the media system because they didn't know anyone who would possibly vote for Donald Trump. But it continued more into what we've seen since then, which I think the Hunter Biden laptop story showed us, which was this kind of anti-speech activism in the press. We saw it with COVID. We saw it with the laptop. This idea that this sort of information is too toxic to even get into. It's potential misinformation or disinformation. So we need to keep it from the public's eyes. And we saw that in the way that the tech platforms worked with the intel agencies here in America to have this sort of collusion to suppress and silence it. But then the media joined in as well because they refused to call out these tech platforms that censored the New York Post, that made it so you can't share this link. And I believe it really was the beginning of this new era of even more dangerous form of suppression and media malpractice.
And I mean, look, we're going to talk a bit more about the Twitter files and all of that in a moment, but you also say that even before Trump, things started to get weird with the Ferguson riots in 2014. Remind us about that case and what started to happen to journalism then and during the Obama administration.
Yeah, this is really where I start the book also with 2014 and something that we saw, which ended up becoming kind of narrative over facts. And the Ferguson riots came out of what happened with Michael Brown. And for anyone who knows this story, you may remember the phrase, hands up, don't shoot. That just became this rallying cry as something that Michael Brown was said to have said before he was shot and killed by a police officer named Darren Wilson. It became this real racial justice moment in America, one of the first of this latest movement that we saw. And what happened was a year later, the Obama Department of Justice found that that never happened. He never said, hands up, don't shoot. Instead, he ran at the officer, grabbed for the gun, and that's the circumstances to it. But we never really got that reporting. Instead, the media themselves even went and said, as far as to say, it wasn't so much about if that phrase was ever actually said, it was about the movement that it inspired. And it became this point where journalists became activists, but also became afraid of what might happen on social media because of the way that you have to be acceptable in the way you cover something. It really was the beginning of this new era of all the problems that we saw during the Trump era, but it actually did really begin before that.
And let's talk about that social media thing, because you even have a little graph which I thought was fascinating, and it was about the way social media distorts the choices that editors and journalists make. And you make the point that even if you're factually right, if you cover a story in a way that is seen as the wrong approach by the Twitter-type people, you're still going to be in trouble. Can you share some more examples of that sort of thing?
Yes, yeah. This is, it used to be, is it true or is it false? Is it correct or incorrect? That was what mattered with journalists. No longer. Now there's this new axis. Is it acceptable or is it unacceptable? And we saw this with like the Jussie Smollett story, where a lot of journalists saw this story from Jussie Smollett and they just went with it. Oh yes, it was a racist and homophobic attack on this actor in Chicago. Of course, it was MAGA related. Of course, we must further that story before we even know the facts. And that was acceptable. And so yes, it turned out to be incorrect, but at least you covered it in an acceptable way. And then you saw certain outlets, Entertainment Tonight, an entertainment outlet, used the term alleged racist and homophobic attack, and they were pilloried on it by some of the most elites in our government and in the media because they were daring to question this story. So they covered it in a correct way, but they got backlash anyway. And it has this real chilling effect because now, yes, no longer is it about getting it right or wrong. It's also about making sure you're acceptable, because otherwise you might be subject to backlash.
Yeah, and I mean, it was one thing was Jussie Smollett, but the other thing that was much bigger than that, of course, was COVID and the kind of narrative that went around COVID and all of the stuff that now, looking back, we think, how did people ever fall for an awful lot of the stuff that they were told was, absolutely truthful during that time? And the media just lost all its skepticism. How did that happen during COVID?
I think it started from a place of real fear. There was legitimate. It was the once in a lifetime pandemic. I understand that there was a lot of fearful, and they ended up trusting their sources, that their sources were corrupted in a way that they never would have expected. The science community, they should be the ones giving us the true information. And so they didn't really catch themselves on that. But I think it got worse also because eventually we learned more about the effects of things like lockdowns or masks and the real nuance, the real complication to these stories. They were not so black and white and cut and dry, but instead of going and doubling down and having some introspection and trying to get it right for the audience, they continued that suppression. They continued acting like there was only one true acceptable opinion when it comes to COVID. And I think the public really turned against them because of that.
And I mean, one of the parts of your book, you talk about COVID and you say that Anthony Fauci was just an absolute master at playing the media and shutting down voices like Jay Bhattacharya, who's a great friend of this program, and a lot of other voices who had more nuanced, different things to say. How was somebody like an Anthony Fauci able to so deftly play the media like it's a piano?
I know. He was part of the system, and he had been for decades. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is one of the dozens of people that I talked to on the record in the book, and he talks about the way that he was approached by media outlets who were saying that he was spreading disinformation and trying to, hurt the elderly, when in reality it was just the opposite. He was an advocate, a Stanford, scientist, an advocate for a targeted approach to COVID. And he was certainly proven right, but he was excommunicated, and he was not only treated that way by the scientific community, but by the media as well, treated like he's this quack and censored because of what the campaign that the Faucis of the world ran. They had a real grip on the media, and the media just went along with it. The entire corporate press, from the New York Times to CNN on down, they went along with the consensus line on COVID.
And indeed, they did, and they've done that on so many other issues, that the Hunter Biden laptop and a million other things we could talk about. But now we've seen these revelations during the Twitter files and some of these hearings we've had on at Congress that, you've got the corporate media, social media, and even the FBI almost working in tandem. I mean, this is clearly not what the guys who wrote the First Amendment had in mind, is it?
No, you would think, I describe it as the elite censorship collusion racket that we see with the way that the media works with these other sort of elites in the government and in the tech business community. And no, you're right. If there's any occupation that should be understanding the First Amendment and freedom of speech and about the free exchange of ideas, that should be journalists. I understand that activists may want to censor content, sure, but journalists, they should be the ones that are pushing back against this. They should be the check on power and on behalf of the people. Instead, they are part of it now, and it's only gotten worse since Trump left office. They've really clamped down on this idea of free speech and free flow of ideas. They go after people like Joe Rogan, who's just having conversations. It's really a really concerning effect of the media, and I think the public gets it. I think it's what's behind the real lack of trust in the public has, including independents, including left-leaning people. The lack of trust in the press in America is at all-time lows, and I think it's with good reason.
Steve Krakauer, we're going to have to leave it there, but I could talk to you all night about this stuff. Absolutely fascinating. The book is called Uncovered, and I urge everyone to go order a copy.